slog FPV. I think Emax has done a great job of coming out with beginner to intermediate lines of quads, and an example of this is their Tinyhawk line. I like that they have real FPV pilots give them feedback in their development, and then also help with the tune, and I think that shows. With the Tinyhawk 2, that's no exception. I really like this little quad, and I'll go over the pros and cons and why I really like this little quad. But first, let's go through the specs. It's essentially a Tinyhawk 2. The electronics are, but it comes with a carbon fiber frame, and then it has the 2S pigtail on the back here, like the freestyle version. And then also it's sporting 1103 motors that are 7500 kV. But other than that, it's really identical as far as electronic components in the camera to the Tinyhawk 2. So the wheelbase here is 90 millimeters, and the dry weight is approximately 48 grams. And then with the two 450 mAh batteries, 1S batteries together, it's about 73 grams all up weight. As far as the flight controller, it's again the same one. It's an all-in-one F4 flight controller. It's the Maytech F411. The ESCs are 5 amp BL HELIS 4-in-1. And then the receiver is the Emax SPI receiver, and it's compatible with FrSky D8 mode, although there's some confusion around that. I actually set it up for D16 mode, and I'll go over that later. As far as the FPV system, the VTX on here is power switchable between 25, 100, and 200 milliwatts. I always set mine for these small micro quads to 25 milliwatts because this is running an SPI receiver and the range isn't that great. So I just leave them at 25 milliwatts, but if you want to run it higher wattage, you can. You can do that. Also set that in the smart audio, so it does support that. What I really like about this, it has the RunCam Nano 2, which I think is a great little camera. So what's included in the package here? Of course, you have the Tinyhawk II Race Edition. It only comes with one set of props. These are the Avon Blur props, 2-inch props. It does come with a package, a screwdriver and some screws, and then a little connector here that you can run it in 1S mode, but I wouldn't recommend that. And then also it comes with the 2 batteries, so you're going to need some extra one of those. And I actually really like these little USB chargers because it's easy just to plug them into your computer at lunchtime if you want to fly out in the park, when you're out at lunch. So I actually kind of like those. But other than that, that's about all you get, in the little case. So here are my thoughts on the Tinyhawk II Race. For what it is intended for, which is tight backyard flying, or someone who wants to set up a track in their backyard with gates, I highly recommend this quad. So the pros, I think the tune is good. I was getting a little bit of prop wash on tight turns, which probably can be tuned out, but for racing, that's no big deal. Also, what I really liked, when you're flying the Tinyhawk 2, you really feel like you are in control, and the power is not overwhelming, which I think is a good thing for beginners and intermediate pilots. I think the camera and VTX are excellent. All my videos were shot at 25 milliwatts, and I was getting a really good range even at 25 milliwatts. The flight time, I was getting 3.5 minutes pushing it hard, and then 5 minutes if I was just poking around. I think the USB charger is very convenient if you just want to plug it into your laptop and then go out and do some lunchbox flying. Also, the design of the frame, and I think is top notch, and the quality of this little guy I think is quite good. So the cons, I think a serious FPV racer might think this quad's a little underpowered, but I would argue most of the serious FPV racer pilots, at least the ones I know, they build their own. They're not, unless they're doing spec racing. Another con is the SPI receiver, like the other Tinyhawk line here, does have limited range. And that's why I run it at the VTX at 25 milliwatts, as that pretty much matches up well with the receiver range, and that kind of provides you some video range feedback. Also, another con is the insert in here doesn't accommodate. If you look at it, there's no cutouts for the props, so you can't really fit this in. So I might experiment with cutting out the foam here. So that's a minor nit on it. But other than that, I highly recommend this quad. So before I get started on showing you what changes I made from the factory defaults for the Tinyhawk Race 2 edition, I wanted to clear up some confusion around whether or not it supports D16. If you look at the documentation that Emacs has, they mention D8, but nothing about D16. And the reason for that is FrSky in their infinite wisdom came out with a version 2 of D16 protocol, which is not compatible. And there's a good video on that Joshua Bardwell put out, and I'll link it below, on what the incompatibility issue is. But if you're like me and you have a Access Protocol later edition, this is the Taranis X9D Plus SE 2019 version with Access Protocol. It does support the version 1 of D16. And in fact, I think it's going to come out with a later version of firmware that might make it incompatible. That is compatible with the version 2. But again, I'll direct you to Joshua's video on that. But for now, if you haven't upgraded at the time of this video, you're fine with binding to your Taranis radio in D16 mode, and I'll go ahead and show you how to do that. So this isn't a complete how to set up a model from scratch. That's a pretty big topic. This is just a video on the changes I made from the factory defaults and how to set up D16. The assumption here is you already know how to set up models already. So the first thing you're going to want to do is going into the model setup here, and you're going to want to select ACCST D16 mode instead of D8. And then it'll show a bind and the number of channels. So you're going to scroll down here, just what I had, and then I'm going to hit bind. It's just select 1 through 8, doesn't matter. And then you're going to hear a beeping. I just have a volume control here. You can hear it binding there. So now that we have the transmitter in bind mode, we're going to need to connect the model to Betaflight. So you're going to go into the configuration tab here, and the first thing you're going to need to do to get it to bind is you're going to scroll down here to receiver and change it from FrSky_D, which is for D8, to FrSky_X. And while I'm in this tab, I'll go ahead and show you the other changes I made. I set this to an arming angle of 180 degrees here. Most pilots do that just so that if it gets caught in the tree, you can arm it and blip the throttle and get it out of a tree, hopefully. The other change, I went ahead and reversed my props to props out. I like doing props out on these small micros, which is this direction here, because when it runs into scraggle and branches, it tends to bounce off of them, versus if it's props in, it gets sucked into them. And then also it flies a little more efficiently with props out. In addition to changing it here, you're going to have to go into the BL Heli configurator, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of the video. So the only other change I made here, I like flying with air mode / acro on a switch, so I turn that off. That's just my own personal preference. They had it in air mode all the time, which is fine. They didn't have RX loss selected, which I turned on. The advantage with that is if you ever lose your RC connection, at least you'll get the motor beacon, so you might be able to find the model. Okay, but really that's all the changes I did on this page. And of course, always save and reboot here on the bottom right hand corner. So next we're going to go into the CLI, and you're going to type in bind underscore RX for receiver, and the receiver type is SPI, and you're going to hit return, and you'll see that it's binding. It's a lot easier doing it this way than pushing a button. And then it should connect. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to power off the model and power it back on by just unhooking it from the USB port. So I'm already bound, so we'll go ahead and I'll show you what the indications look like once that's done. So if you're bound correctly, you should see a solid blue light, and then on your Tyrannus, you should see that you have a good signal. But now that we've successfully bound the model to the RC controller, let's go ahead and connect again. Let's go to the power and battery management tab. I did not change the settings here as far as the minimum cell voltage and maximum cell voltage and warning cell voltage. I just left that alone. On the PID tuning tab, I left everything at stock. Later on I might look at changing this to enabling RPM filtering, but for now it's stock. I did change my rate profile to what I like. It says these are my acro rates. Let's go ahead and go to the receiver tab, and if you'll notice, there are 16 channels here, and that's what you get when you run in D16 mode. If you're in D8 mode, of course, then there's only 8 channels. So I'll quickly go through how I have my channel set up. Okay, so aux1, which is my arm, that was just like it was from the factory. aux2 is the mode channel, or mode switch. The thing I have different from the factory, I have aux3, which is my rate switch, and then I have aux4 as my flip over on crash and my D-shot beacon, so for lost model finder. So let's go ahead and go through the modes quickly. Again, this is aux1 is my arm. My mode switches between angle, horizon, and I like air mode being on a switch when I'm running an acro. You can see how that works. And then here's my flip over on crash. You can see how that moves. And then of course the buzzer setup is on that same aux4 switch because it's a 3-position switch. Always save when you make any changes there. When you want to set up a rate switch, you need to put it into enable expert mode. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then you're going to go over to the adjustments tab here. And it's real easy to set up. It was on aux3, so you're going to set that to aux3 here. You're going to go into, you're going to put in rate profile selection in the drop down menu, and again you need to change this to aux3 on this side as well, and then just put the range here to max and save. And then when you go back to the PID tab, you can see if I put it into the rate on the rate tab here, you can see that my rates change. The other 2 rates are my racing rates. I don't race, but sometimes I'll set up a little track and tool around on that. So on the OSD tab, the only thing I really did was just rearrange things the way I like them. And I think I might have turned on the mode, fly mode. But other than that, I really didn't do any other changes here. One thing that was kind of interesting in the alarms, they put in RSSI here. So that's all I changed from the factory. So next we'll go ahead and I'll show you how to change the motor direction in BL Heli configurator. I brought up the BL Heli configurator. You're going to need to go ahead and connect, and of course you're going to need to make sure that you have your batteries installed to power the ESCs. And I'm going to go ahead and read setup, and all I had to do was just go into each one of these pull down menus and select reversed, and that's basically it. You just have to write that setup by selecting it, and you are done. So the last tips I'm going to show you, I went ahead and added some shrink tubing to the antenna for the receiver, and I added a little bit of heat shrink tubing to the VTX antenna. The big deal here is this stiffens up the receiver wire. It's a little loose, and the concern here is getting it sucked into the props. And then I also added some tie wraps. You need to use the thinner tie wraps, and they actually have these little slots here to accommodate that. You can see that. And then I also added some strain relief here, which is just a tie wrap here to hold the pigtail in place, so it doesn't get ripped off the flight controller board in a crash if the battery gets ejected. So other than that, that's the only other things I changed. So I greatly appreciate you tuning into my channel, and thanks for watching. So definitely not the best weather to be doing my maiden flight on the Tinyhawk II Race. Gusts up to 20 miles an hour, sustained wind about 11 miles per hour. So we'll see how well it does. But this is weather you wouldn't be flying a Whoop in, but since this isn't a Whoop class quad, let's see how well it does in the wind. Well, this thing did it surprisingly well in the strong winds. It's not very enjoyable to fly when it gusts up that high, but if I was flying a Whoop, it would be in the next county. But the little Tinyhawk II Race did pretty well in the wind. Obviously, it's hard to do close proximity flying, but overall, I was pretty happy with how well it flew in the wind like this. So I'm going to wait for a calmer day and take it out again and fly a couple of packs through it on a little more desirable conditions.